Welcome back to Why We Wander, a podcast from The Wandering Scholar about the who, where, and why of travel. Hosted by me, Tamara Walker, and Shannon Keating. Hi, Shannon.
Hey.
So I have a question for you. What do you think of when you think of a tourist trap?
Trap is the interesting word there, right? So, because I don't always think of, tourism as necessarily being a bad thing, but certainly if you're in a tourism trap, that's negative. And I think that when you're in a trap, it means that maybe you didn't quite realize what you were getting yourself into. And maybe you thought that the experience that you were about to have was going to, for whatever reason and whatever your motivations are for this, was going to be perhaps like more authentic than you expected it to be. And you suddenly realize when you're in whatever that experience is that there's something that's off, right? That maybe you don't feel right about what you're experiencing, how it's being presented. Maybe you feel like you're not getting your money's worth. I'm not, it's not a position I ever really expect to be in because I'm often not really thinking about my experiences in this way of like trying to get this like insider view of something. I'm a bit more of a sort of just like roaming around and seeing what happens kind of person, not really like seeking out like a particular experience or paying for a particular experience. But I can imagine this being a situation where you're just feeling kind of like, oh, wait, what is this? Is this real? Like questioning the reality of something. So yeah, those are just some of my first things that come to mind when I think about this concept of a tourist trap. What about you? What comes to mind for you?
Yeah, it always seems to have a negative connotation. And to my mind, it's something that involves like long lines and maybe underwhelming experience once you get to the front of the line, or something that's really crowded and you're kind of jostling for position. So maybe one example comes to mind is the Mona Lisa. So the Louvre itself is probably a tourist trap, but like that in itself is, especially now kind of in that post, I think it was a Beyonce and Jay-Z video that did I'm sounding 100 years old, but they did a video at the Louvre in front of the Mona Lisa. And I feel like that kind of made it a thing that a lot of people wanted to see. And it's always, it's been around for a long time, but I just remember going after that and feeling like it had been so crowded, like the crowd around it, everyone with their cameras out, trying to get their photo, trying to get a photo without a bunch of heads in it. And you really did feel kind of trapped in everyone else's attempt to experience it. And really, you didn't get to engage the painting itself. And I'm sure there are lots of other experiences, like maybe just staying on the Paris beat. There's like this falafel place that's really popular that also means that there's a really long line. But already I'm starting to kind of be a little critical of the negative connotations, because like that place had really good falafel. So even after I waited for a long time.
So it actually was good.
Yeah, it was really good falafel. And like the same with the Mona Lisa. It's like, it's still the Mona Lisa. Like you still get to see it with your own eyes. You don't get to get really close to it. And so in some ways I do think that, and we had Eliza Gihano on a couple episodes ago, or many episodes ago, where she is someone who provides virtual tours of the Louvre and is able to give people a really up close and personal view of images like the Mona Lisa, which have been digitized with really incredible cameras that allow you to see levels of detail that you can't get close to in person anymore. Like unless you're a docent working at the museum or a curator or a conservator, you can't get that close to it. And so maybe for something like that, it is better experienced at home and online. But it was really interesting to just kind of be in this place and be surrounded by people who are trying to experience the same thing as you. And there's a sense of competition around it that is really unpleasant. But yeah, that's what comes to mind when I think of a tourist trap. And I wondered too, as you were describing your own definition, like, is it synonymous with it being touristy? Like, is something that's touristy also a tourist trap, do you think?
Well, no, see, that's where I think there's a difference, because I actually think that there's a lot of touristy experiences that are not really negative. I mean, there's a lot of examples of places that people visit that are totally set up for tourism, that are able to handle the amount of traffic that they get, and that end up being like a happy, positive experience for the people who are participating in it. So I think that tourism in and of itself, especially if it's tourism that kind of is set up already for that mass tourism kind of feel, like can be like okay, and people can feel like they got exactly what they were hoping to get out of it, and not feel trapped. Like I think that I don't know, I haven't been to Disney World or Disneyland in a long time, and we've like talked about doing an episode on it just to kind of explore what it means to be a traveler or a tourist at a place like Disney World or Disneyland. But you think of a place like that, it's so touristy, right? I mean, it is the definition of tourism. But it is not necessarily like a trap if you were prepared for what it's like. You kind of know what the ins and outs are going into it. And nothing is a surprise, right? Like, whereas I think a tourist trap is like what you were saying with the Louvre, like you're going there, you're like, you just imagine yourself like being like practically nose to nose with the Mona Lisa, and then you get there and it's just like totally not what you had in mind. So I think a lot of it actually is sort of preparation, and doing some of your homework up front. And kind of knowing what the pitfalls are going to be, so that you don't feel surprised or taken off guard when you get into a situation and you don't have like a hat and you're standing in like super hot sun in a line for forever. So yeah, I don't think that something being touristy is always a trap. I think a trap is like a bad version of a touristy experience. Yeah, I'm trying to think of another example of something in my life recently where I felt like I was in a tourist trap. And I think, maybe one of the benefits of the past 2 years of a pandemic is really not being in too many examples of a tourist trap, right? Like most people are avoiding big lines right now. And it would almost be a welcome sight to be one of many in a tourist trap situation, I think.
Yeah. And, I think some of this is a matter of perspective too, right? Because if you think of it as this negative experience, then it is going to be one. And if you think of lines as inherently bad and, popular interest in something as inherently bad, then yeah, it's going to be obnoxious and off-putting. But I also think that, things end up being tourist attractions for a reason, right? Because they're incredibly beautiful, or they have an important historical meaning or an important cultural meaning or spiritual meaning. And, there is something to my mind that is also special about a shared experience of something. So for example, I am planning this trip to Ireland. I'm going for a conference and I'm bringing my mom and some family members along, my sister, my aunt. And, one of the iconic, and you probably know this better than I since you've traveled to Ireland, and I need to get your advice on things to do while I'm there. But it's funny because the Temple Bar in Dublin is, I think, an iconic tourist trap. And it is something that, people on TripAdvisor rate really lowly and, say avoid that at all costs. It's just full of tourists. But to me, that's also what makes it important, right? Like these things are appealing to tourists for a reason. And, in that one, it's got this like incredibly large collection of whiskey. It's also a really old establishment. And so that in itself is appealing to people. But again, I think there is also something that is really interesting and valuable about a shared experience among tourists, people who come from different parts of the world. They're not just coming from your own country. They're coming from other parts of Ireland. They're coming from other parts of Europe. They're coming from Asia, Africa, etc., Latin America. And so to have this shared experience, if you don't have a shared culture between and among all these different people and you don't speak the same language, I kind of think that's cool. And we tend to put so many kind of negative associations on tourists, and often for good reason, but there's often an overcorrection so that we think of things that tourists like as inherently bad, inherently, things that we need to avoid. And I just find that to be troubling and it gets us away from the things that make travel so special in the first place. And some of it is that. Some of it is the inconvenience. We kind of talked about that in our last episode. And some of it is kind of being not just around locals, because sometimes that is the thing that you want to experience of a place, like the people who actually call it home. But the other part of it is this kind of common humanity that is drawn to this particular place. And maybe that's really hokey to think about, but it is, to my mind, an important part of the experience of a destination too.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I think that that example, if you're going to that bar, like you have done your homework, like it's going to be crowded, and maybe you will pick a time of day or a week to go where you won't have to stand in such a long line to grab a pint, or maybe you'll have a plan to go there for one drink and then maybe like go for a long walk and come across some corner pub where you spend the rest of the evening. So like, I think that it's all about like how you think about it. And if it's kind of like the end all be all, and you have this idea that when you go, like it's going to be this individual experience just for you, and you're going to be frustrated if there's like people all around you that are also trying to have a good time, then you're going to be disappointed because it's not going to be that. But if you go and just take it for what it is, and then come up with some other ideas to create that local experience that you're hoping to have, then I think that you kind of get the best of both worlds. And I think the other thing with touristy places is that, as opposed to maybe like a tourist trap or like a negative tourist location, is also whether the place is set up for tourism. And a bar like the one you're describing, and kind of just that area in general, they're ready to deal with crowds. People who work there know what to expect day in and day out. It is set up economically for that. And that's the expectation, is they're going to be busy. And I think what's difficult is when you go to a place that is not ready to accept the level of tourism that it's receiving. And I think that that's like a different kind of tourist trap, and maybe not the one that people always think of, where they're like, oh, I didn't get my money's worth, or, oh, this or that. But like, when you find yourself in a place where you're like, whoa, like my presence here is not helping the local situation, whether that's ecological or how people who work there are being paid, or is it basically, taking over a place that for locals is actually an important place for them to be able to gather and meet, or for like children to have a space to run around. So I think that there's tourist traps that aren't always in relation to the traveler, but it's a trap for the people who normally live in that place, or the other beings, like the ecology of that place. So I think that that's, another thing to think about when you're evaluating where to go and whether a really touristy thing that you might be doing is worth doing, as not just what it's going to be like for you and whether it's going to be worth it to you, but whether is your presence worth it to the place that you're visiting, or are you doing damage that you really don't need to do, and maybe you could just look at pictures of that location. So I think that that's a whole other side of this.
But it's all connected, right? Because I think a place like Venice, for example, is a tourist trap, and also a place that is appealing to tourists for a reason, because it's so beautiful and it's such a unique sort of city. But it's also a place where people live, and the attraction, like its existence as a tourist attraction, is also threatening its very existence. And so there are issues of sustainability around that probably mean that everyone is better off perhaps going to places other than Venice, surrounding areas. You might not get the same sort of canal and gondola experience, and the same photo opportunities that we think of and associate with Venice. But it is a place that might not exist much longer. And if we can at least make it a place that the people who live there can experience for as long as possible, then maybe there is something to kind of steering clear of it, which is in keeping with a lot of the things that we've talked about when it comes to sustainability and travel. But, the other thing that you're making me think about is that, at the end of the day, all of the pushback against tourist traps and, reticence to end up in them, and the tips to avoid them are about making sure that you have as positive an experience of that place as possible. And I found an interesting article on oyster.com that does a lot of travel advice giving. And I just wanted to run down some of the ideas that it presents, because I think they're all really interesting and maybe a little complicated, and things that I, agree with in part, and just wondered what you thought of as well. Because the first one that it suggests, this article, is to research before and after you arrive at a destination. I think that's pretty interesting, and something that you and I always advocate for among our wandering scholars, and even in this podcast, to be prepared for the destination. But one of the suggestions that it makes is to not only ask locals about the places they like to go, but to ask even more specific questions. And by locals, they mean like friends that you have in that place, but also perhaps a hotel concierge or people that you might meet at a cafe or something. And one of the suggestions that they offer is to ask the local, where would you take a first date? Or where do you like to shop for birthday presents? And I wonder what you thought of that bit of advice.
I love that personally, because I feel like that immediately is just a great question to ask, because it's not saying, what's the best restaurant in this city, because then the person is going to feel this immediate need to kind of like just go look at like the top 10 list, or think about that from like an outside perspective of this person wants to know the best. What would they think is the best? Where are they coming from? How should I kind of shift my response to kind of meet what I think their expectations are? And instead, it's just making it completely personal and just asking the person, from their own perspective, what they would want to highlight from their area to somebody who, they're trying to impress. So I think that's actually a really fun question. It's never occurred to me to ask that way.
Yeah, and it's one that can be tailored. Like if you're traveling with kids, you don't really care about a restaurant where someone's going to take a date, right? And that would probably be annoying for the locals to have someone roll up with their like band of screaming children. And instead, maybe it's like, well, where do you take your kids on a Saturday morning when, everyone's up and ready to eat? Or like, where do you go when you get off work if you're talking to the concierge or something like that? So I do like the idea of kind of asking very specific questions that are tailored not only to what you want, but to making sure that you're going to fit in a reasonable way at the place that you're going to.
Yeah, that's awesome. Perfect advice.
Okay, so advice number 2, or tip number 2, I should say, is look for locals. And, they say that the number one sign that you've stumbled into a tourist trap is the complete lack of locals. And, the example that the author gives here is that, the only locals that you see in Times Square are the ones who are just trying to cut through to get to work or to catch a train or something. And that the rest of the people who are intentionally there are tourists. And so you want to avoid those sorts of places and ask locals the things they like to do in their hometown. And that could be something like a bookstore, or a restaurant that's not advertised, or a concert, or something else. So that's at least the Oyster way. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think that's fine. You often hear that kind of advice when it comes to restaurants. It's like, if you're in Italy, look for a restaurant where everybody's speaking Italian, and that's going to be the best place to eat. And I mean, it's fine. I guess I think of like the Times Square example, or any of these things. Like if you said, first of all, it's not true that there's not locals in Times Square. There are many local New Yorkers working in Times Square, whether it is to support the tourism economy that's there, or just like the many restaurants and stores and, bodegas and offices and entertainment places and everything that are there. So like, it's not really true that there's not New Yorkers in Times Square. And I just think, it's about balance. And I guess if what you're trying to get out of New York is what it's like to live in New York, and you want to just go and sit in the financial district and watch people walk back and forth, that's fine. But I think it's really fun to do a little bit of both, and it's okay to like enjoy your time in a place and see some of the sights that are to be seen, and then also spend some time wandering around and getting a little bit lost and realizing that you are the only person in a neighborhood who doesn't live there. That's fine too, but I don't think that it has to be like the number one rule of thumb when you're traveling somewhere.
Agreed. I also think about the fact that, these are websites that are accessible to anyone with an internet connection. And by the time you take that advice, it does create a domino effect where, you go to off the beaten path neighborhoods and go to cafes that are favored by locals. And then, that becomes a place that has equal numbers of locals and tourists, and maybe soon enough more tourists than locals, because the locals are like, we kind of want a place that's all our own. And so it does create this interesting dilemma where, you do wonder how much of a place should you as a tourist leave to locals and for locals to experience. And this came up in a previous episode in conversation about Amsterdam and how the pandemic has kind of given the city back to locals, and they really like it. They like being able to, walk down the streets of their neighborhood and not see, someone's vomit or someone passed out from like a stag or hen party, and just to be able to experience it the way they had experienced it before Airbnb came to town. Because that's also the ethos of Airbnb, right? That you belong everywhere and you live like a local and you're in neighborhoods, but enough of those units are in enough neighborhoods that they end up being dominated by people trying to have a local experience. And so then it kind of scares locals off, or, takes it away from them and turns that into a tourist trap, or something that is at least, catering more to tourists and their particular needs, because you still have specific needs as a tourist that are different than what locals need or want of a place, And so it does kind of make me wonder, like, how much do we owe locals to just let them have their haunts, let them have their restaurant where they've got their favorite table, and they only have to kind of worry about themselves and not, having to help someone who can't understand the menu or something like that. Or maybe I'm romanticizing what a place is for locals.
Right. That's an interesting question. I think I've talked about my experience having lived for a couple of years in a somewhat seasonal town recently, and the difference between being like feeling like being a local versus being somebody who's like coming there to be more of a vacationer. And I don't know, like part of it is just like, when you're a local somewhere, you just kind of recognize the seasonality of things as well. I guess this is just like for a place that has more seasonal tourism, which is, a fair amount of places that do get super busy. It's because there's a particular time of year when they're really, other parts of the world are really cold and it's a warm place or something like that, or vice versa if you're looking for winter activities. But, I don't know. I think that you, as a local, you kind of adapt and like you recognize the seasonality, and you also sometimes recognize that that's important for the businesses that you love, that they get really busy at certain times of year. And that's what enables them to serve you as a local during the quieter times of year. So it almost like makes you happy that they're annoyingly busy at times. So, it's nuanced, right? It's like, we all want to see the places that we love prosper and the people that we care about that are in our community that are creating those places prosper. So when they do, that's not always a bad thing.
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, so tip 3 is to ignore hawkers and touts. And it kind of describes the scenario that I'm sure is familiar to a lot of us, which is that, you're in a touristy zone and there are people holding menus that are written in English in your face to get you to come to, their restaurant and try their prefix menu. And they are really expensive menus and the food isn't always really good. And so the idea is to kind of avoid those strips. And they usually are strips, right? It's like a pedestrian walkway where on either side is someone with their menu out. And so the idea is to avoid that and to instead, ask around for other places. So what are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah. I have to admit, like I'm not typically wooed by the hawkers that want you to come to the restaurant. I am somebody who tends to be like, okay, I'm just gonna find my own way here. But it's also a question of how hungry are you? And like, are you trying to eat in the next hour where you are? Or do you have plenty of time all day to decide where you're going to have dinner? In which case, maybe you go and ask around where you're staying or read your tour guide book. But I suppose if the question is, when do you know you're in a touristic zone and you thought maybe you weren't, is when you see people saying in a million different languages, come eat at this restaurant, then that's probably a good signal that you're somewhere touristy, even if that wasn't your intention. But if you're already there and you need to eat, I'm trying to think if I've had an example where we had been, lured into a place from that, and the food was either particularly good or bad. And I mean, I think it's just certain places that there was a zone for eating, and that zone, the people are trying to get people to come to their businesses, and that's what they're going to do. It doesn't necessarily mean that the food is bad. It's just, I think that it's just the way that people advertise, kind of on the street advertisement, not always a terrible thing.
Not always a terrible thing. And honestly, like I'm thinking about Peru, for example, because in Lima, there are a couple strips like this. And I've been to them. And I have to say that even the worst Peruvian food in Peru is better than a lot of, attempts at Peruvian food in the US. And so, and likewise with Italy, like I remember going in Sicily to a strip like that and feeling like, okay, yeah, I probably paid more than I should have. And this seems like a pretty basic version of something that, in like some mom and pop place is probably even more delicious, but it's still pretty delicious. I'm still eating fresh pasta in Italy. Like, really, can I complain about this? I don't think so. And so sometimes we over fetishize the unique and the local. And again, I think that there's a lot to be said for the thing that is being offered up as a kind of classic representative of this place. And it's not always a bad thing. And, if we're trying to go to famous places, then we have to expect that we're not special snowflakes. We're going to be around other people who have the same agenda in mind, and we just have to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so true.
All right. Tip 4, don't sleep in tourist zones. And this is, advising against sleeping in hotel zones or, neighborhoods that are filled with chain hotels. So the example they're giving is like Midtown Manhattan or the hotel zone in Cancun. And they, caution against this because these are zones that also have restaurants and just sort of bars and cafes that also cater to tourists. So you're kind of, by definition, stepping in or out into a tourist trap. And so the suggestion is alternatively to, choose a hotel that's located away from the beaten path. You might end up paying a bit more for transportation, but maybe there's better food, better shopping, and a scene that locals actually hang out in.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I really like this advice. It's an easy one because it's a plan ahead type of advice rather than that like sort of like in the moment, where sometimes I think like once you're in the moment, like the example of where to eat, like if you're already visiting somewhere, you're having fun, like don't make some big deal about where you're going to have lunch. Just eat somewhere. Like you said, have a glass of wine, enjoy the view. But this one, I think that, you can be more intentional about where you're staying. And I think when you're looking at tourist zones, it's also often really big international hotel chains that own all of that property. And so it's not just kind of like you're going to pay a lot for maybe a subpar experience and you're going to be surrounded by tourists. It's also that money is not necessarily going back into the local economy in the same way it might if you were going to like a more like boutique hotel or a vacation rental or like a bed and breakfast or something like that. So I'm a huge proponent for finding like local chains, boutique hotels, just like smaller chains in general when it comes to to staying places. I mean, that's something I do absolutely every single time I book a trip for myself. And so I really don't have too much of a argument against that one.
Yeah, and we still need to do an episode where you share some of your tips, because I think that's something that you're super good at, and it does make for a really cool experience of that place. I guess the only thing I would add, and not to just be contrary for the sake of it, but I do think that, some of it depends also on what your priorities or concerns are, right? Because hotel zones tend to be better lit, better populated, and if you're a woman traveling alone, those are things that you absolutely want. If you are a person of color who doesn't want to be, mistaken for a sex worker or for, something that you're not, then maybe venturing further afield might raise flags or just attract attention from people who aren't as welcoming as you might want them to be. So, we sometimes fetishize locals and assume that locals are universally, accepting and welcoming. Mm-hmm. So some of it is also a recognition of, the realities of some of the places that you visit, and like a place like the hotel zone in Cancun, and not to kind of put stereotypes on Mexico, but there have been recent news reports about, cartel violence and it's encroaching upon some of these hotel zones. And so it also can kind of burden police forces and other resources in a community to venture further afield if they are kind of hotbeds of activity that you don't want to get caught up in. So I think all of these things, there's no, I guess the point that I'm kind of arriving at too is that there's no one size fits all set of tips and strategies beyond maybe the first one that is about doing your research. And also, and we can circle back to this, but I think maybe another important tip is to just have your own sense of priorities and principles in place when it comes to traveling, because some of these suggestions assume a set of principles that you might not share as a traveler. Okay, tip 5, watch for translations. And the idea is to bristle at the idea of something being advertised in English, French, Spanish, Mandarin, because that's almost a guarantee that it's a tourist trap. And the problem with that is that, these are places that try to appeal to everyone and therefore appeal to no one, because you can never be broadly appealing without getting something wrong or, disappointing someone. And that instead, if you went to a Italian place in Florence where the menu is entirely in Italian, then that's a better chance of having an authentic experience than if you go to something that has multiple languages listed on the menu.
I don't know. I mean, I guess if you're talking about the very specific example of a restaurant that's like right across the street from, the Eiffel Tower, and it has like translations in a million languages, maybe in that example, you might be better off walking a block away from that because you're going to be in a really crowded restaurant, right? But I don't think just because a place is recognizing that people speak different languages that visit there means that it's not a place worth going to. I think, again, it's just the recognition that if you're anywhere where they have, they're considering the fact that they have such an international representation of tourists, then you're already in a place that's going to be probably pretty crowded. You must be somewhere like a pretty big attraction. So I don't think that is something that's like a major thing that I have ever really paid attention to. And if anything, I think it's probably a positive that you're able to see that they're thinking about multiple languages.
Yeah, and there's probably some nuance there, especially with Chinese or Mandarin and Cantonese, because we've seen in recent years that the largest number, or one of the largest number of kind of tourist populations are Chinese people. And a lot of those tourists have a lot of money to spend and want particular kinds of experiences. They want, for example, fine dining experiences. And I've had this experience of being at a restaurant in London that was not a touristy restaurant. It was a restaurant that, if you're into a particular kind of food scene, then you know about. And that was a menu that was both in English and in Mandarin. And I feel like it was in recognition of the appeal that it held to not tourists in general, but to a particular kind of tourist coming from a particular place that they wanted to cater to. And I think, just to your point, that like a lot of these places are doing it to be welcoming and aware that, you know, they do have a core customer that they should you know, appeal to or accommodate as much as possible. So yeah, as with all things, I think that one's also got some nuance to it. Okay, the last one is avoid countries that rely solely on tourism. And it checks a lot of Caribbean islands and Asian countries that rely heavily on tourism. And, you know, the author acknowledges that's not inherently a bad thing, but it does mean that it's harder to have an authentic experience or to get away from crowds, because these are places that have kind of set things up with, you know, particular kinds of hotels and, you know, package experiences that make it so that you're all kind of experiencing the same thing. And the best way, at least according to this article, to avoid these kinds of experiences is to stay at smaller boutique hotels or choose a destination that doesn't fully rely on tourism dollars. So what do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I think that's complicated. I think that, and they're kind of getting at it in this last point, I think it's more how you're choosing to spend your tourism dollars in that place, like where you're spending the money, rather than whether that place is a place that has a lot of tourism as its main economic driver. I think that, yeah, granted, if you go somewhere where tourism is their number one, you know, way of making income for that location, then there's probably going to be a lot of tourists there. And if you're trying to be the only tourist somewhere, then it's probably not where you want to go. But that doesn't mean that it's not going to be an interesting time for you just because of that. I think it's just like it's sort of just like a weird way of thinking about things. It's sort of faulting the place for finding that they can generate income from tourism, rather than maybe faulting the people who are going there for maybe having misspending, you know, or do you know what I'm saying? It's sort of like blaming the country or blaming the region or whatever it is, and I don't,
and punishing it, right? Saying don't go there, take your money elsewhere.
I just don't like it. It just doesn't. It's just not a good tip. It's just not the right way. I don't know. I think some of these other tips are interesting, but this one just doesn't feel like it's really going to get anybody anywhere, and just not really a worthwhile way to think about things. That's all. That's all I got on that one.
Yeah, and it goes back to something you said earlier about the importance of patronizing places that are owned by locals, and that, you know, even in hotel zones, you can find those sorts of places. And even in these places that rely on tourism dollars to sustain their economy, there are increasingly more places like that, and that have kind of tourism models that bring more of the money that's flowing into the tourism economy into the pockets of local people and give them a certain kind of ownership. And so again, it's not a one size fits all thing, and you miss out on a lot, like especially if you're looking for authenticity, you know, that seems to be something that gets fetishized, then you're discounting an entire region of the world that you wouldn't get to experience from a cultural perspective or an interpersonal perspective if it were really about that. And so it does seem to punish those places and to, you know, privilege places that are already privileged enough, right? Exactly, that they don't need to rely on tourism. Like Europe already has so many benefits that it reaps from its place in the world and from its own history, that here we are just rewarding it again and limiting the kind of interactions that we can have and limiting the potential of travel. And, you know, it's also something that, you know, means something to you and I, having had our first travel experiences in a place like Mexico that is reliant on tourism dollars. But we weren't in Cancun, right? Like an entire region is not defined by its tourist zone. It is connected to it, right, from an economic perspective, but there's so much more to that place. There's so much more to these Caribbean islands, again, because people actually live and work there and have, you know, culture that they produce there. So you're missing out on a lot to think of it as a hard and fast rule to say like, oh no, it relies on tourism dollars and therefore it won't get my tourism dollars. And I guess there's also something to be said, and maybe this is a topic for another episode, about what we mean when we say we want something authentic, because there's a lot of things that are authentic that for a tourist or a traveler aren't what they want, right? And like sometimes that hawking is authentic, or sometimes, there's a authentic pain and struggle, or authentic kind of political culture that we're not necessarily trying to get caught up in. And so we put a lot of romance on this concept of authentic that probably shouldn't be there, and ends up being a trap in and of itself, like the authenticity trap, because then you're feeling like anything that isn't, precious and special and unique is somehow, a lesser experience, and that you've somehow been shortchanged because you haven't had that, when there's a lot that's perfectly lovely about the generic tourist experience. I mean, that's why it's so generic in the first place.
It's so true. And I mean, I think if anything, what I'm coming out of this conversation with is that the way to quote unquote, like avoid a tourist trap is to avoid being trapped by the concept of a tourist trap, right? That there's a lot of nuances, and that even when you're, getting travel advice, whether it be from, Shannon and Tamara on Why We Wander, or reading The Oyster, or reading any, travel magazine, is that you have to look at the nuances. That like a lot of things are said in a flippant way, or a way that, that people kind of repeat the same things again and again, like, oh, avoid the translated menu. And you just dig a little deeper and think about your own motivations and priorities, like we said, before you kind of go by the book and by the advice that kind of seems to be the commonly held beliefs on how to be a good traveler. Because there's like a lot below the surface once you start thinking about it.